Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be moderating the coming hour for you with a fantastic panel on prepping for a 1 to 4 degrees scenario. What is happening with our humanitarian work in a changing climate already today and what's coming our way the coming decade. Maybe first to remind you, we have an active presence on social media, and I hope many of you joining this session today will be entering your ideas and questions into the chat, but also join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag HCBerlin for a wider footprint of our discussions here today. To share any thoughts that you pick up, let's widen the discussion even to a broader audience than are with us today. Secondly, it's my pleasure to start by introducing an amazing panel that will be sharing their thoughts on this topic with you today. I'll be giving a brief introduction. My name is Maarten van Aalst, and I'm director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. But I'm delighted to be joined by 3 fantastic panelists, starting with Afroza Hake, who is a humanitarian worker working on anticipating disasters. So the question to her will, of course, be, what do you anticipate in a 1 to 4 degree scenario? She's been working with the German Red Cross in Bangladesh and supporting to implement the innovative approach of forecast-based financing since 2017. Prior to joining the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, she was part of different INGOs, including Habitat for Humanity International, ActionAid Bangladesh, and involved in various innovative and multi-country projects related to humanitarian response, climate change, and adaptation. Very warm welcome to you, and very happy to have you in the panel. Come back to you in a minute. Our second distinguished panelist on this great panel today is Fawat Durrani, who works with Greenpeace since 2016, particularly on climate change, migration, and conflict, and the interlinkages of these 3 topics. Again, clear why we are so delighted to have him on the panel here today. His team has commissioned a study on this topic performed by the University of Hamburg in 2016. So he'll be able to tell us about that. He also works as a campaigner to raise awareness on the impacts of climate change, for instance, talking to schools and universities. So part of the question, of course, is also what are our humanitarian concerns, but also how do we communicate them better? So it's great to have your experience on the panel, Fawat. Welcome to you as well. And finally, Festus Yambu, who is with Welthungerhilfe in Kenya. He's been working with them for the past 7 years. By training, he's an agricultural economist. Started his work with Welthungerhilfe by working with communities in rural areas, mostly in arid and semi-arid areas, but increasingly also working on disaster management. He leads the forecast-based financing project of Welthungerhilfe in Kenya, and also works on drought and its impacts on communities. So again, someone at the front lines of these rising risks will be able to share both personal experiences and technical analysis of the topic at hand. So a very warm welcome. I'll come back to all of you, but would you like to say a few words to the audience by way of introduction? Maybe say hello and why you're in this panel, Afroza?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. This is Afroza Haq. Thank you, Martin, for introducing me with the audience. I'm here in this panel because I'm working with German Red Cross in Bangladesh and as well in the project name Forecast-based financing, which is implementing early actions or anticipatory actions in Bangladesh. We are targeting mainly disaster like cyclone, flood, and also now working a bit on heat wave. So yeah, that's a brief about me, and happy to join the team. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Fawad?
Yes, hello, everyone. It's nice to be in this panel with the other speakers and, of course, Martin. Looking forward to our interesting discussion. And already Martin said everything about me, so I don't need to say it again. Thank you.
Great. Welcome to you as well. And finally, Festus?
Thank you very much for having me in this panel. As Martin has already indicated, the issue of climate change is one of issues which are very key in the world today. So I'm excited to be here to share experiences as well as to get insights from people around the world. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you as well. And once again, welcome to all three of you, and welcome to everyone else in the audience. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat so we have a sense of who's in the room. Maybe also a reminder, once again, use the hashtag HCBerlin on Twitter. But also, for those of you who need it, there is sign language interpretation and captioning available on the conference website. So, and I'm actually very pleased that the organizers have arranged that. I think it's important to make our panels as inclusive as possible. So thanks to the organizers, and a good reminder to everyone to think of everyone and being inclusive also in how we conduct our meetings. So then, without further ado, let me give a quick introduction to this topic. Prepping for a 1 to 4 degree scenario. It's a really wide range, this 1 to 4 degrees, right? The 1 degree is basically what we are in already. And quite a bit beyond the 1 degree is what we are locked into already. We know that the climate has already warmed. We're facing the consequences today. We'll be hearing from our panelists about that. We also know it's going to get further warmer, and that will create further humanitarian challenges. Now, I'm a coordinating lead author in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where we're actually trying to do these graphs of exactly what will happen with various degrees of temperature rise. And when those graphs were first created, I think the first time was in the third assessment report, so in 2001 that came out. Most of those graphs were talking about a future. So it was looking at what climate change might do in the further future. And the main image that people had at the time of what climate change was going to do to the world was a polar bear on a shrinking piece of ice in the Arctic. And those were scenarios that people were talking about what might happen toward the end of the century. And the question was primarily about how much do we need to reduce greenhouse gases to avoid that from happening. But of course, even the discussion was, are humans to blame at all for climate change? Now, over the past 20 years, that discussion has really shifted. And if you look at our graphs in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the current generation of those same risk assessments, how risks are going up with temperature, show that the risk has already gone up today. So what we saw in the past was that starting from today, the risk is going to go up sometime in the future, and then it will get worse as the temperature keeps rising. We now clearly see that we are already in this phase of elevated risk, and humanitarian risks are an important component of that, the increasing extreme events being the most prominent. So we're in that changed world. We're already in this more than 1 degree warmed world, and we're in for more almost regardless of what we do. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also looked at, with a special report that was commissioned between the regular cycles of these big reports, looking at the difference between what it would mean to have 1.5 degrees temperature rise as where we would end, or 2 degrees. And it turns out 1.5 is pretty much what we're almost locked into already. We're nearing that in the coming decades. 2 degrees is already going to be a real challenge to stay below. 1.5 is going to require every effort we can give it to reduce our emissions to still stay there. Now, at 1.5 degrees, it's clear that the challenges we face are already significantly worse than they are today. So we are in, as a humanitarian world, for a much more difficult climate, even in the most optimistic scenario on the greenhouse gases side. Going from 1.5 to 2 degrees, that's also the range that the Paris Agreement that was agreed to 5 years ago specifies. At 2 degrees, it's already a lot worse than at 1.5 degrees. And you can count that in terms of ecosystems. So for instance, coral reefs will almost certainly be almost entirely gone. That also means the protection provided by those coral reefs, for instance, to vulnerable coastlines and atolls, will be gone. So there is a huge implication of that small increase in temperature, even between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Now, business as usual, so doing nothing on the greenhouse gases today, is going to get us way beyond 2 degrees, indeed towards the 3 or 4 degrees that the title of this panel implies. If we would get there, that would be dramatic. And the sort of scenarios that we see are heading us toward much worse implications of the sort of things we already see today in terms of increasing extremes, but also a range of tipping points, both in ecosystems, but also in human systems, where the sort of language that scientists are now using is about limits to adaptation. And those limits to adaptation, what we can still cope with, are already in sight in some humanitarian contexts today, and will get increasingly worse as we move toward that 4 degrees. So this is the pretty harsh setting that we are discussing today. Now, to bring it back to the humanitarian realities and the setting of the really difficult humanitarian situations that many of you are confronting in your humanitarian work every day, we will not be exploring the dark and desperate world of 4 degrees warming. That is going to be a really big problem, and let's just agree that that's what we need to avoid. But let's confront the reality of what humanitarian work is already confronted with today with the more than 1 degree warming, and where we're headed with that 1.5 and 2, and what we need to do, first of all, to adjust our work and be able to cope with that increasing challenge, but secondly, also to communicate the challenges that we face in the world. So that is the charge, I think, for our panel here today. And let me, without further ado, get to Afroza. Afroza, I don't see you on the screen, by the way, by now, so I hope you're still there. Otherwise, I'll go to Fawat first. Let me just ask that. Afroza, are you online, or do we have a connection problem? Okay, I do see Fawat still. So given that Afroza is not there, maybe I can start with you. Fawat, one of the implications of climate change already today is this issue of displacement and even migration. Now, your team works on the interlinkages of climate change, migration, and conflict, and you commissioned a study on this. Hi, Fest, it's good to see you back. We're slightly reversing the order of the panel, starting with Fawat. I'll come back to you in a minute. You commissioned a study on this topic. Can you tell us a bit what you found in that study?
Yes, of course. So I will start with some of the work that we as Greenpeace have been doing. We started our work in 2007, and we commissioned a study on climate and migration. It was in a German titled Klimaflüchtlinge. And then we had, after this refugee crisis, commissioned another study, as the Europe says, crisis. The replication of this study was by the same professor at Hamburg University. And this was also on the climate linkages of climate change, migration, and conflict. And I would like to be precise about or find what we have discussed or argued in our study is about the, of course, the attribution of migration and conflict to climate change impacts, especially to sudden onset disasters like flash floods, hurricanes, landslides, and also the slow onset disasters, which is, for example, the sea level rise. And it's very much clear that people migrate, and they have been migrating for ever, and this cannot be controlled. But the climate change impacts have made people more vulnerable to the impacts, and this pushed more and more people. For example, the intensifying sudden onset disasters or weather events, this has caused many people to flee at the same in a very large group. And the slow onset disaster, they not have a lot of numbers, but there are scientific proofs that people flee on gradual basis and in a small group. So there are two types of now migration, we could argue, related to climate change. And of course, the number that one of the agencies based in Geneva, Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, has, they produce every year an annual report, and they say the average of 25.4 million people are displaced because of disasters, weather extremes. And this is more than double the number of people displaced because of conflict. And we say that climate change is a threat multiplier, meaning that climate contributes to other political, social, economic problems, and eventually this leads to mass migration leads to increased conflicts, especially in countries where there are already tensions going on. People are struggling with poverty, with unemployment, and this increases and exacerbates their situation. So these are the main findings, but for the recommendations, we will discuss that later, as I understood, because I wanted to limit myself for 3 minutes for my answer. I can't hear you, Martin.
Thank you for that reminder. So we will come back to these issues, and let me also invite the audience online to add your comments in the chat on this. And I've noted the comment that the YouTube live stream apparently is not on, so I'll ask the organizers to have a look at that. But for now, Fawat, continuing maybe a little bit on that other issue I mentioned. So you're talking about the threat multiplier, the challenges that are already being posed by climate change today that may grow worse in the future. Now, you also work as a campaigner. You're touring through Germany to raise awareness. How much do people know, and how do you convince them about the severity of the challenges we're facing?
Yeah, I'm glad that I have the chance to talk further. So science is pretty clear about this issue, that there are interrelationships of all these different factors like climate change or climate crisis, migration, poverty. They are all interrelated. But the problem here is that the media does not talk about these interrelationships. So when it comes to the discussion about migration or refugees, they only talk about the conflict. And people here in Germany, for example, that I had a tour around cities in Germany, and I talked to people. So when we talk about migration and displacement, people think of only the conflict. But there is another underestimated catastrophe, which is one of the main root causes of people being forced to displace, and that is the climate change impact. And it is quite new for people and to see all these connections because of so many political reasons and agendas. The media is avoiding talking about all these linkages, and that's why we, as Greenpeace, we aim to raise awareness, to look into the root causes of conflicts and displacement. And that's how we do it, through exhibitions, through online campaigns, through holding debates and discussions in different national and international conferences, like this one that we were part of this conference last year, and we are part of this year as well, where we are trying to establish a very solid working relationship with the humanitarian organizations together, because environmental issues and humanitarian issues are no longer separate issues. They are entered, and people are suffering because of the environmental disasters. So, and that's how we work with other organizations, and through showing our solidarity with humanitarian organizations like MSF, for example. They are doing their best to protect the human right violation, to protect rights, of course. And we also call in our different campaigns, we call for prompt industrial and social adaptation to global warming. And of course, as you mentioned before about the scenarios that already that we are fixed with 1.5 or 2 degrees, people are suffering. People will suffer in a very bad way without a rigorous climate mitigation. Massive human rights violation will occur, and a lot of people will be vulnerable. And we call for a prompt climate mitigation and the protection of vulnerable people especially in poor and vulnerable countries where there is very much little action and mitigation, adaptation and protection problems. So
okay, well, let me from there make an immediate bridge to Afroza, who is back with us now. Afroza, you work in Bangladesh. So from your work with communities, how is climate change already affecting their lives?
Yeah, thank you for having me back. There was an electricity connection. Yeah. So as you already know, I work in Bangladesh with German Red Cross. So it gave me the opportunity to work directly with the community. The local people here in Bangladesh, they're also aware of the increasing disaster, and they share their stories when we interact with them in the community. So more frequent events like a flood, a cyclone, a river erosion, heat wave, cold wave, those are linked to climate change. There might be some other actors too, but people feel that erratic rainfall, temperature change, changes weather pattern, which are causing frequent disaster and impacting their life and livelihood in the community. Like we go for a flood, like frequent flooding impacting the agricultural activities, one of their major livelihood options in Bangladesh. The flood also trigger sometimes the river erosion, and from a report from Center for Environmental and Geographic Information Services, they said that in last 4 decades, Bangladesh's 3 major rivers, which are the Padma, Meghna, and the Jamuna, have engulfed more than 162,000 hectares of land. And that is roughly 5 times the mass of the country's capital city, Dhaka, And they also forecasts that from 2017 to 2020, there will be, it could eat up another 4,500 hectares. But in 2018, the erosion was more than it was forecasted. Even my family became climate migrant due to river erosion. My permanent address is now under Padma River, and my grandparents, they had to migrate somewhere else, leaving everything behind them. Apart from that, in recent years, there are increasing number of people severely being affected by heat wave. So one of our study that we did earlier this year, it shows that 86.5% of the responded, they're feeling hotter summer compared to 5 or 10 years back. And around 83% of the responded, they said they are incurring more medical expenditure due to hotter summer in recent years. And the people who are working in the street, the rickshaw puller, the hawkers, day laborers, they are losing their working hours during the daytime. And flooding every year, it affects millions of people. And this year in 2020, the flood, it hit Bangladesh several times. So it had 4 waves. So, and among them, 3 of them were in extreme level and impacted the community really bad. And people, they lose their livelihood because agriculture is the major activity in rural Bangladesh. So their agricultural land was underwater, erosion was there. And this year, the heat, the temperature was also a bit higher. So comparing all these things, people are suffering every day. So increase the frequency, increased frequency of disaster, it impact the livelihood by impact their livelihood options, reducing their working hours and their income, increasing the expenditure, and impacting them socially, economically, and also impacting their well-being in every possible way, including casualties in different times. So yeah, people are nowadays also feeling it. They are also suffering on it, and they know that there are changes and it is impacting them, and the climate change is there. It is happening now. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for sharing such clear examples, and also good to remind ourselves it's not just the big storms and it's not just the floods. It's also things like heat that are getting worse almost everywhere, and we're often not even counting the impact. And as you say, the impact in terms of people really losing their lives, but a much wider range of impacts also on livelihoods. Really moving to hear that from the front lines, including even your own family. Thank you for sharing. Now, in terms of solutions, you work on a forecast-based financing project. unfortunately, I know we could talk about this for the full hour or even longer, but can you give us a 2-minute introduction on what forecast-based financing is and how it relates to the impact of climate change in Bangladesh?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. Let me give a brief about the forecast-based financing first. So the forecast-based financing is a program that enables access to humanitarian funding for early actions based on in-depth forecast information and risk analysis. The goal of FBF is to anticipate disaster, prevent their impact, and reduce human suffering and losses through anticipatory actions. FBF actually implement pre-agreed early actions for extreme events in the short time between a forecast and the disaster happening. So FBF is not to act annual recurring disaster for which people have their own coping mechanism. Rather, it acts for extreme events which have higher magnitude of impact on human life and livelihood, and it's beyond people's coping capacity. For example, a flood which is occurring every year in Bangladesh is not might not considered as an extreme event, but a flood which have a like 1 in 10 year return period and which might stay for more than 3 days in its peaks and impact around 40% people and damaging 25% of household assets. Is an extreme event considering the climate change and other phenomenon around. And in that situation, it exceeds the coping capacity of people where FBF trigger to implement early action to reduce the loss of in the potential affected community. But in recent years, when we started implementing FBF in Bangladesh from 2015, and if we consider last 5 years, we had, if I go with the example of flood, we had 4 floods reaching FBF threshold. Which I just mentioned, 1 in 10 year return period and other thresholds. So whereas FBF was not actually designed to trigger every year, but now with frequent reaching trigger level, we are facing the challenge almost every year. It requires more resources, more concern and action to increase the resilience of people, which we are targeting to work on. Yeah, so that is how it's now impacting the overall activity of forecast-based financing in Bangladesh.
Thank you again, and really powerful both to understand a bit more about the solution space that you're trying to implement to get an answer to this rising set of challenges, but then also how even those solutions are now being affected by what we're facing. A really powerful example. I see that we have just lost Festus. I was just going to come to him next, but maybe given that we have, oh, there you are again, Festus. Great. So moving from Bangladesh to East Africa, and then maybe also moving a little bit from extremes like flooding and storms and heat to drought and food security. Your country also is facing the impacts of a changing climate. What do you see happening?
Well, thank you very much once again. I should say that climate change has affected the humankind in all ways. And in terms of food security, I can say that climate change has affected all the pillars of food security: availability of food, accessibility to food, utilization, and also stability. And as we have seen in this country and also in the whole region of the Horn of Africa, that some of the effects of climate change have been drought and flooding. And we've seen that over the years, the frequency of drought and also the intensity of the drought situation has increased. And this means that we cannot predict the seasons when it comes to the farming communities. So we cannot determine when to plant crops. And therefore, over the years, food resources have been depleted, and the farmers cannot be able to plant
Festus, I'm afraid we don't hear you anymore. Afroza, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I'm afraid it's Festus's connection. Let's come back to him in a minute. Maybe I can already start getting to a few questions. Oh, Festus, you're back. No, maybe not. Okay, let's come to a few questions in the chat. So first of all, I see Torsten Klose with us online, another expert in some of these areas, noting the World Disasters Report on the topic of climate change that is coming out on the 17th of November. So watch this space for further information on these issues, and also the website of the forecast-based-financing.org, where a lot of the information around Afroza's presentation could be found more in depth. German Red Cross actually also being a really leading actor, not just in Bangladesh, but around the world, also starting up the Anticipation Hub shortly to support this sort of work on the solutions. So for those of you who want to know more, please go there. For now, there is a question specific to Bangladesh, Afroza, which you might be able to address. Where are the displaced going to resettle in Bangladesh? So Alicia Blancarte notes that she read 18 million people will be displaced by sea level rise alone. What are you going to do about that?
Thank you, Alicia, for your nice questions. Yeah, every year we are having lots of people displaced due to river erosion, and there's the prediction of people being going to be displaced due to sea level rise. So the government is working on that one. They are working on the Delta Plan and a few other things just to ensure that the displacement number of people getting displaced reduced due to the impact of climate change. And also there are climate trust fund and other funds where it's being introduced to reduce the climate change impact. And though there's no specific plan yet to resettle the plan by resettle people, but most of the people who are being displaced due to river erosion or sea level rise, they are coming toward the city areas and being settle themselves in different slum areas in Bangladesh. So every year the number of slum dwellers is increasing because people are coming towards the city areas and starting to settle themselves in slum areas. But yes, there is not yet any concrete plan for that one, but the government is working on that one to finding some solutions for that one. As Bangladesh is a very densely populated country with a very with a huge number of populations, it's a very big challenge for the government to work on that one. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. It links maybe particularly to the second part of Julien Boucher's question. Hope I'm pronouncing the name right. We'll come back to the IDRL question on the beginning of that question, but for the second half, so what sort of schemes are foreseen to address the situation of environmental refugees and displaced in the context of loss of habitable land? I don't know if you would like to say more than you already did, Afroza, from the context of Bangladesh, or otherwise I might ask Fawat also from the perspective of the study that you commissioned, what sort of international solutions you would see.
Martin, do you
sorry, Martin, I missed the second part of your question.
There was a question if you had more to add on what sort of solutions might be put in place for these categories of people more broadly. But I mean, you have to some extent already explained what's happening in Bangladesh right now and how much of a challenge that is. So part of the question would also be, where do we go as a world with this? So I was saying as a second half that, I mean, if there's more to say from a Bangladesh perspective, then we'd be keen to hear from you, Afroza, but otherwise we might go back to Fawat and also hear if his studies shed any light on the sort of solutions for this.
Well, I think you're right. I already covered whatever the solutions I had with me, but there are plans, studies going on, but no specific plans yet to resettle and other things. So I think, yes, you can go to Fawat for this one. Thank you.
Fawat?
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, I'm basically from Afghanistan, and I have also experienced displacement, worked with displaced people. I have worked with migrants, and we have been in war and conflict for decades, and at the same time we are experiencing the worst impacts of climate change in our country. So, and I've worked in almost all the provinces of my country. So, of course, like Bangladesh, people come to the urban areas where the governments do not have the capacity to relocate them as compared to other rich countries. So for some type of solution, that what should be done in order to avoid migration. So as I said before, migration cannot be stopped at all, but forced migration should be avoided, especially with decentralized and direct financial support to people. In most of these vulnerable countries, the governments are also somehow responsible for not helping people. The aid that they get from the international community, that is the corruption. And that's why we say that this approach of moving money, like Green Climate Fund or EU aid or World Fund, they all should change the approach of moving money to these vulnerable countries, and they should actively reach people and help them in building, for example, or installing early warning systems, installing a water management system, install land management system. So people somehow could fit from all these small projects rather than focusing on very large and big programs or projects. So that's how we could avoid forced migration. And of course, at UN level, there isn't the lack of the statement of declaration. There are so many things have been happening at the international level. For example, the Paris Agreement, and at the same time, we had the Committee on Loss and Damage, where they established a task force specifically working displaced people because of climate change impacts. And they produced their recommendations last year, and now they have started a new phase of their work. Also, the Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration signed, and the Compact for Refugees was signed. These are so many processes have been taken place. But the main problem is the behavior of key people, the behavior of people who have the capacity to act on these. So all of these documents are non-binding, does not hold any government responsible for what they have been doing. That's why we say that there should be some type of legal and a legal binding document where people who are missed by the climate change impacts are protected, especially across the borders. Because when they cross the borders, then there is international law to protect them. That's why we say that there must be some sort of protection law so that we differentiate the different types of people moving for what reasons, and so we cover everybody and we do not leave anyone behind. So that is one of the other suggestions. Of course, the regional agreements and initiatives established by the international community so that governments work together hand in hand for the climate mitigation together. And I was just listening to Donald and Joe's debate, and they said that Joe gave an example, said that we have to walk and chew the gum in time. So in that we are trying to protect and mitigate the climate change, but at the same time we need to protect people. At the same time we need to these vulnerable countries' governments and reform their governance system, especially fighting with corruption. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And to some extent, that already addresses the additional comment also to Julian by Alessia Blancarte. So very rich. And I already saw another contribution in the chat from Torsten Klose, pointing to another resource here that's addressing the same area of work. Really rich and clearly an area where indeed a lot of work is happening in terms of discussions, also on the international level in the climate discussions, but often a big gap between the international challenges and intentions and indeed the people most affected. What I often find is that in these climate discussions, there's a lot to draw from humanitarian experience. And for instance, also the discussions that we've had for a long time in humanitarian work around localization. And empowering local organizations, local communities themselves to take charge of some of the solutions. And it'd be good that the climate world would not reinvent the wheel, but draw on some of that experience. I see another question here from Khairul Sheikh. As you all know, there has been less emissions of greenhouse gases, less flights, etc., since the start of the current pandemic. Does that mean we will perform well in terms of global warming targets this year? Would either of you be able to address that? Otherwise, I can take a stab myself. Okay, let me take that then. It's an important question, of course, especially if we are wondering about this 1 to 4 degree scenario. I mean, is this year going to help us get on track towards staying closer to the 1 and not going to the 4? The honest answer is it's a little bit of good news, but only a tiny sliver of good news. So the way you should see it is like a bath that is being filled with water, and the greenhouse gases are the water. So there's more and more greenhouse gases coming into the bath, and the tap is still open. So there's water running into the tap. And what happened this year is that the tap is slightly lower, but still the bath is filling. So the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere are still going up. Global warming is still continuing, but it's just going slightly slower than it would have without the COVID impacts this year. Now, of course, economic productivity is down, so there may be a bit of a lasting impact. But overall, we're still essentially on track to keep rising from year to year rather than going down in terms of these concentrations. There are a few pieces of good news maybe. So for instance, what you see is some investors seeing that oil prices, for instance, also crashed this year. And that might be a sign of what's going to happen to oil prices over time as the world starts shifting to renewables. So you see a couple of investors getting more nervous about some of those, what might become stranded assets. So if those things take hold, there could be a more lasting impact. In the end, this all depends on how we rebuild our economies after COVID-19. So the real question is, what do we take from this crisis? And I think it should be taken in 2 ways. So one is, will we rebuild greener economies? So when we invest to keep jobs, for instance, do we just keep the old economic activity and we keep all those jobs? Or do we say, let's try and shift some of those jobs toward the jobs of the future that are going to be more promising as sustainable jobs, but also help actually to reduce those emissions? A second side of the picture is that actually, in terms of the overall concerns around the climate crisis, it's not, of course, just the greenhouse gases. It's also the impacts that we're already facing. And those impacts are only getting worse. So people are hit this year, not only by the natural disasters, but also by the complications of having to take care of people during COVID. I mean, you saw this in Bangladesh with Amphan, Afroza, having to evacuate people to shelters while having to maintain social distancing and having to have protection. I mean, it's an additional challenge. The socioeconomic impacts of COVID come on top of that. So besides the question of how do we have a greener recovery, there would be the question of how do we have a more resilient recovery? We've seen that some of the countries that have had social protection systems, for instance, social safety nets for people to fall back on, were more able to scale up that sort of social protection to buffer some of the economic impacts and the social impacts of the pandemic and the lockdowns. So those countries have benefited from the investments in resilience that they already had. There are messages there for other countries to build those systems and invest in that ability to deal with shocks, also the shocks that are coming. And what you see now is that some countries, so it's interesting, for instance, Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, is really calling for these sort of reforms. But at the same time, you see that we're in a crisis. All the political attention is to COVID. And it's difficult to make these transitions so quickly. So this is, also, I think, also something where we all need to be having these discussions in our own communities and in our own politics, and then in the end also at the global stage. I'm currently more concerned about how the climate risks are getting worse because of the socioeconomic impacts than that I would be happy about the slight reduction in emissions this year because of the reduced economic activity. So in terms of humanitarian work, I think the challenge has grown rather than decreased. Of course, an additional humanitarian challenge is that a lot of money has now been spent on COVID and COVID recovery. And the question is, what will happen the coming years with the humanitarian budgets that we will also need for a growing toll of climate-related extreme events? So we're feeling the pinch. Afroza or Fawat, anything from your end to add to that perspective on COVID?
I think you explained it well, because I personally think that maybe the situation will get even worse from the beginning, before the pandemic. For example, the CO2 emissions now are sinking, but once the pandemic is over, maybe the governments will focus more on the economic development, and that will really bring the CO2 or other greenhouse gases emissions very high. That will be even worse from the beginning of the pandemic. So I think there is a huge risk if the countries do not consider for a green recovery, then things will get even worse. So that's why I do it I don't have a positive feeling about this.
Afroza, what's your perspective from Bangladesh?
I would more rather focus on the COVID and the humanitarian response one, because this year, as you know, we faced the dual challenge of Cyclone Amphan that you mentioned a bit earlier, along with COVID situation, and then the flood along with the COVID situation. So it was really challenging for us, and the humanitarian response it's being really challenging considering this situation in other perspectives. And Bangladesh Red Crescent Society did really quite impressive work during this pandemic situation in coastal areas of Bangladesh while responding for humanitarian activities over there, and also for the flood during the COVID situation. For Cyclone Amphan, BDRCS, Bangladesh Red Crescent Society, implements its humanitarian activities in around 10 districts, providing food assistance, shelter support, evacuation support in countries, and for flood areas, there was cash support and evacuation support and other support. As I'm not expert on climatic issues and other things, so your things I just do really agree. Those are really nice points to pick out. So I just wanted to add that this COVID situation, how it's added to challenges in our activities, in humanitarian activities, and we had to ensure both the social distancing. We had to ensure a more number of shelters in Bangladesh to accommodate the number of people who are taking shelter in different shelters. During cyclone, it says bring people in a safer place together to make them safe. But due to COVID situation, it was saying ensure the social distance between people. So it was a controversial situation for us, whether to bring people together to keep them alive from the immediate risk of cyclone, or to ensure the social distance and keep less people. So it was a really challenging situation for us, and Bangladesh Red Crescent Society did a really great job over there. Thank you for.
Thank you. Indeed, the very immediate challenges of having this compound climate and COVID risk. I'll share a link to a report that also looks at some of the numbers. 53 million people already around the world hit by two types of disasters at once, the COVID and the climate-related extremes. And indeed, the millions in the case of Amphan were adding to that sad total. Maybe also just to illustrate again how these things interlink, the report that Stephanie Lux is referring to, the cost of doing nothing report, with a link in the chat, published last year by the IFRC, says that the number of people in need of humanitarian support could double by 2050, again, dependent on the scenario we as a world choose to take. that scenario depends on two things. It depends what happens in the climate and to the climate extremes, but also to the number of people in extreme poverty. So that reiterates my earlier point that the recovery needs to be both green and resilient, because if we are greener, slightly greener, but we still have a growing number of people in poverty, that would still result in a larger humanitarian toll. So we need to get all these elements of the climate crisis right. There's an add-on question on whether we can see this green recovery in some places. And I think they're tiny examples. I don't know, Fawat, do you have any examples from the Greenpeace side? Otherwise, I can give a few.
I think there is a process going at the European level where they have proposed a plan for green recovery, like creating jobs after 2021, and that was presented to the EU Parliament. And from Greenpeace side, we also have an international campaign on that, where we are also looking into ways how the economy could be recovered and not contributing to a mass CO2 emissions. So the plans, maybe if you can have a look at the EU Green Recovery Plan, you could find more information about that and into depth of what they are doing, really. But as I said before, a lot of things are planned and they stay in the paper, but the actions are so much different. So yeah, that's what I know so far. So as I said, there is a major focus on this green, but there is one process that I know of at the European level.
Great, thank you. And indeed, there are these big discussions going on. There's another process happening in the World Bank, for instance, where there's a sort of checklist for recovery investments and how they can be made more. I'll see if I can dig up the link in a minute. I also pasted a blog that two colleagues of mine and I wrote on the nature of this challenge that might be of interest to some of you in the chat. The most inspiring examples are actually often the very small ones. And I don't want to pretend that we're already getting this right in the whole world by just pointing to those small ones, but they can be very inspiring. And an example is, for instance, the city of Milan, which locked down in the first bad wave in Italy. Northern Italy was, of course, one of the worst hit in the early phases of COVID. So the city of Milan was empty. And people actually really enjoyed the beauty of their city without all the cars going there all the time. So they decided to block off a couple of streets permanently. And they're only going to be accessible for pedestrians and cyclists, which will improve the air quality, which will probably increase the enjoyment of the city center for both their own inhabitants and tourists in the future, also possibly creating the recovery in terms of tourism jobs. And at the same time, of course, result in a greener, smaller footprint of the city overall. So those are, I think, the small gems in a way that should give us inspiration for where we can have win-wins and come out of this recovery greener. Of course, what matters in the end are things that also happen at scale, and that is where some of these policy initiatives on part of the development banks, the IMF, but also indeed the European Union are critical. This is also a discussion that is taking place right now in many countries, and it's often the ministries of economics and planning and finance that are at the heart of that. So we need your humanitarian voices there. And that maybe brings me to another question from Alexandre Choudoneret. As a humanitarian, what do you think we should advocate for in the climate change field? If I may ask you both that question. Afroza, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. So being a humanitarian and being part of focus-based financing, I would say we should advocate for anticipatory works more and more, because the anticipation, we already know there are different scenarios due to the climate change, and like 1 to 4 degree scenarios, there are different scenarios, and evidence are also now in our hand, or we can see the changes in front of us. So we need to anticipate anticipate and act. That is what I should say we should do, advocate for that one. That these are the scenarios in front of us now. It is time instead of responding. So the response is always there, but along with response, we also now need to anticipate and act before the disaster, so that we can reduce the impact of climate change, reduce the impact of different disaster to the human being who are now at the forefront and suffering. So we should advocate for that one, to anticipate and act to reduce the human suffering and losses and at the community level. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Froza, and so clear explanation earlier in this panel on what that means in practice in Bangladesh. Inspiring to see also that these examples of forecast-based financing, for instance, in a growing number of countries, tens of countries now around the world, are being picked up in the context of the global climate commitment. So there is the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership that was launched by the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, actually, at the Climate Summit last year in New York, hosted by UN Secretary General Guterres. That is also one of the cornerstones for the United Kingdom in its presidency of next year's COP, the climate negotiations pivotal moment when we take stock of whether we're on track for the Paris Agreement next year in Glasgow. So I think the connection between this global climate world and the humanitarian world has been found. And now it's a matter of translating that into practice in so many places like in Bangladesh. And it's really encouraging to see. I was at a high-level seminar last week hosted by the Swedish government, which included David Beasley from World Food Programme. It included Jagan Chapagaini, Secretary General of the International Federation of the Red Cross, Mami Mizuturi from UNDRR, the Deputy Director General from FAO. So you see all these actors now embracing this anticipatory way of working from a humanitarian perspective, but then also branching out to the wider set of things that are needed to make those societies more resilient. And it's indeed your sort of work, like in Bangladesh, that has led the way for that and set that example for the world. So thank you for that. Fawat, may I ask you the same question? What would you say to humanitarians? What should they say in in terms of the climate discussions?
Yes, I think, as you said, the relationship pages has already been established, and now change impacts and human rights are now being discussed both at national and level. What we could propose is on regular basis is awareness raising of people in countries with regards to climate change impacts on livelihoods or their income sources. For example, the vulnerable countries are relying on agriculture. Change impact has already threatened their agricultural yields, for example. And we need to raise that awareness that there are things changing and they need to be aware of. So that's how people could, if somebody is not aware, then how could they raise their voice for what should be done? So that's how a democracy or the voices of people could matter. And of course, the capacity building, for example, if people are displaced because of different natural disasters, and this is happening in a very bad way for my country last year. This year, hit one of the provinces and it just destroyed thousands of, killed hundreds of people.
I have to keep it short because we're entering the top of the hour. So
okay. So just wanted to say one last thing, that have to build the capacity of those who are displaced and are resettling or trying to resettle in urban areas in the slums, so that they could be easily integrated in the society and urban areas. And of the protection, I say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A clear call for all of us to address these immediate impacts, but also raise our voices to address the longer term impacts. This was a really rich panel. Thank you, Afroza. Thank you, Fawat. Thank you, all of you who contributed. I know we couldn't address all of the questions yet, but please do continue to chat in the expo and the networking spaces. Thank you to the organizers. And once again, thank you to all, and look forward to continuing the discussion. Have a nice afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.